G'day and welcome to the show without a name. I'm Alex Cameron. Dougal, as you guys may know, is in China. So I'm going to be manning the fort until he puts something together and gets off his ass and does something. So today we've got a very special guest. We have the author of the book Make the Liberal Party Great Again. That's it there. I've read it. And we want to hear more about it. So on the show today, we have mortgage specialist, entrepreneur, and author Johnny Ruddick. How are you going, Johnny?
I'm terrific, Alexander. Thank you very much for having me.
No worries at all. No worries at all. Look, honestly, this is, I guess, the talk of the town at the moment.
Good to hear.
I mean, every man and his dog has an opinion on the Liberal Party and leadership. Why don't you give us kind of, if you can, the rationale behind the book, the reasoning? Is there some kind of deeper, kind of almost call to arms?
Well, look, the guts of the book is that we're saying that every member of the Liberal Party in Australia, so that's people who have paid an annual membership fee, which I'm guessing there would be at the moment about 50 to 60,000 people, would have a national convention once every 3 years to elect our federal parliamentary leader. And the states and the territories would have their own state convention to elect their state parliamentary leaders. So what we saw in Canberra a month or two ago when Malcolm Turnbull was replaced by Scott Morrison, that was 83 people met in a secretive closed room and they voted for who our Prime Minister is going to be. Now, about a third of the people who were participating in that vote, immediately after the vote, were going to be promoted to the ministry.
Right.
So it's a wide open invitation for people to say, okay, well, I think the candidate which we'll call A is the best, but if I vote for B said that they would make me the Defence Minister. So therefore I will vote for B. Now, if I suspect that we would have 300,000 members of the Liberal Party across Australia, if they knew that they could pay their membership fee and they would get a vote.
Yeah.
Now, if you've got 300,000 people voting, they can't be bribed. You can bribe enough people in a room of 83 people, but
Sure.
You can't bribe 300,000 people. Now, this does seem radical to Australians, but this type of process is now standard operating procedure in the countries which are most similar to Australia. Places like Britain and Canada, and even our own Australian Labor Party has partially brought this in. When Bill Shorten contested the leadership event against Anthony Albanese, the party room had 50% of the say, but the party membership, which was about 38,000 people, they all got a ballot as well. Now, that was a good start. I think we've got a much better model outlined in the book than what the ALP's done, but at least the ALP is on track for this to embrace this type of reform.
Okay, so I guess what kind of the crux of it is there kind of an inherent conflict of interest.
Yes.
So although kind of everyday Australians will vote Liberal, they don't actually they're not really getting a say on who's going to be leading the party, nor pre-selection, which I guess if you take it back to the kind of the genesis of the problem is that candidates at the federal level, as well as I believe the state level, are being pushed forward on the basis not of credentials or kind of appeal to the wider voter base, but more to allegiance and loyalty to a few select individuals.
Well, the way that the current the party currently selects its lower house members is, well, in New South Wales, it's a pre-selection. So that means, let's say we recently had one in Wentworth, where we're sitting right now, the federal seat of Wentworth, when Malcolm retired. So there's about 1,000 people who are paid up members of the Liberal Party who live in the federal seat of Wentworth, and they all belong to various branches, the Bellevue Hill branch or the Vaucluse branch or the Rose Bay branch. So all those branches met a week or two prior to the pre-selection, and they all voted for about 10% of their branch to have a say in the pre-selection. So it's a very small group of people. It should be, what would make a pre-selection a plebiscite is if every person who's a member of the Liberal Party and lives in Wentworth, they would all get a vote. That would be called a plebiscite. And that is clearly a better system.
Yeah.
But even better, and what we argue for in the book, is that we should have primaries. United States-style primaries,
Sure.
which is where you don't even have to be a member of the party. That means we'd have, in a seat like Wentworth, we'd have 10 to 20,000 people would say, yes, I care about who the Liberal candidate's going to be. Those Liberal candidates would have been campaigning across Wentworth, say, look, vote for me in the Liberal Party primary because I'm the best, because I believe in A, B and C.
Sure.
And someone else will say, no, don't vote for him, vote for me because I believe in X, Y and Z.
Almost like a kind of Darwinian style survival of the fittest on kind of policy and objectives rather than...
Well, yes, it would be fought, the contest would be won over a combination of their policy positions and their personal popularity.
Sure.
Personal popularity is always going to have a role to play in politics. So it's better to be principled rather than popular, but it's better still to be both.
Sure. What I also noticed in the book is you kind of what's happened over the past several years, I guess, across both parties, but we're talking about the Liberal Party today. The idea of leadership spills being quite frequent. I mean, you often hear people in the media say, well, I've got a 5-year-old and he's seen X amount of prime ministers, and they throw their hands up in the air and they think it's a smart comment, like it's an educated comment. But what I also gather from the book is that kind of leadership spills are a symptom of the disease, and not only are they uncommon, but they've happened historically quite frequently as well.
There was going to be a large appendix in this book, which briefly looked at all of the party room wars on the non-Labor side of politics since Federation in 1901. But that appendix very quickly became its own book.
Right.
Well, hopefully, it's largely written. But we'll see how this first one goes. But that looks at the extreme bitterness and dysfunction which has been going on for well over 100 years. And it's a result of not of the personalities involved, it's a result of the process which has not changed in over 100 years. So what is happening now in the age of social media is that these party room wars are becoming more frequent. I don't think they're getting any more bitter because they've always been maximum bitter.
Yeah.
John Gorton was the Prime Minister of Australia from, I think, 1968 to 1971. And there was, for most of the time he was the leader, he was being undermined and leaks against him from his cabinet. And it all came to a head and there was a tied vote. No one knew what to do. So Gorton threw his hands up. He says, okay, well, I'll resign. But then the bitterness continued. Now, 30 years later, when John Gorton died, at the state funeral in the city in Sydney here, Tom Hughes, who was a major cabinet minister at the time, got up and gave the eulogy. And 30 years after the event, he attacked at a funeral, a state funeral, with all the prime ministers, all the press there and everything. He attacked Malcolm Fraser in quite a bitter manner. So this was... I bring up that story only because I show you, look, the bitterness is...
It's a symptom of the disease.
That's right. But what's happened, the reason it's getting more frequent now is because the system is totally broken and it's like an old car that keeps getting repaired but keeps breaking down.
Right.
And keeps breaking down more frequently.
Right. And I guess as well there's more publicity considering with social media. Everyone can have a say, I guess.
That's right.
Look, we often hear about factional power broking. That gets thrown around a lot, but I feel like people don't really, in general, don't really understand the actual mechanics of how that works.
Okay.
Do you want to go through and explain, if you can, kind of the way in which someone who's operating and putting people in seats or for pre-selection actually does it?
Okay, well, look, the Liberal Party and the Labor Party are two very, very strong brands. So there are millions of people out there who their whole life, from the age of 18 to 88, will vote for the Liberal Party candidate. We recently saw in Wagga a wipeout for the Liberal Party, but you still had 1 in 4 people vote Liberal. Okay, and that campaign was beset with problems, and the Liberal candidate who just resigned was resigning in disgrace. But you still had 1 in 4 people said, I'll vote Liberal anyway.
Yeah.
So it's a very powerful brand. So what the what these factional bosses have worked out through the very old party rules that we currently have under our party constitution, where a very small group of people can say who's going to be in the parliament. So what they do is they spend their whole life orchestrating who those very small group of people will be. They want to they want to make them delegates to pre-selections. Now what they want to do is they want to get people who are loyal.
Can you explain what a delegate is?
Well, a delegate, so 9 out of 10 party members will never be a delegate. Right. 1 out of 10 are. They're usually the activists. And they're the ones that have a real say about who our candidates for parliament will be. So to gain control of this very powerful brand, the Liberal Party, you just need to work hard on party affairs to make sure that people who are loyal to you are the delegates. Right. And therefore choose who goes into parliament. So it's a very undemocratic system, and that's what we're trying to change.
Okay, so the delegates control the pre-selection?
Yes.
Is that what happens?
You're a delegate from a branch to a pre-selection.
Okay, right.
But look, these rules have recently been changed in New South Wales so that we, after the next state and federal election, will now be having plebiscites, which means everybody will get to vote. So it was a small step forward, but it was also a significant step forward.
Right. I guess what we've seen, the reason. What do you think are the reasons for kind of the power behind the brand? What is the pull, the traditional pull of the Liberal Party? Like, what are the values that people, I guess, identify with? Mm-hmm. And how much damage do you think has been done to the perception of the brand as a consequence of kind of the deterioration of the party, particularly at the leadership level?
Well, look, when the Republican Party was founded in the United States in the 1850s, it was founded on one issue, which was anti-slavery. And the equivalent for the Liberal Party, when Robert Menzies formed it in the 1940s, was a robust support for free enterprise. Now, people, particularly on the left, like to sort of downplay how serious the communist threat in this country was. But in the late 1940s, there was so many strikes in this country, and there was serious discussion, because the Communist Party was becoming so strong, there was serious discussion between the Liberal Party and the Labor Party merging to become an anti-communist front.
Is that right?
That is true. The federal president of the Liberal Party publicly said this is what we need to consider. Menzies wasn't in favour of it, but they said that the communists are becoming so strong. Now, the Labor government under Ben Chifley did take them on, and so that there was a lot of bitter wars on the left in this country over the communist issue.
Sure.
And then what happened look, I think a lot of people were still quite idealistic about communism in the 1940s. But by the 1950s, particularly after the Soviet crushing of the Hungarian uprising, a lot of Western lefties who were pro-communist walked away from communism. But the ones that stood with communism, even after they saw all the atrocities of communism, well, they're the real baddies.
Right. And do you feel as if, is there any influence, I guess, from the real hard left today? Is there any remnants of that still around?
Oh, well, these people have worked out, particularly after communism collapsed, they've worked out that they can no longer say that they're communist.
It's a tough sell.
But the whole thing about underlying Marxist theory is that society is bad and we need to overthrow it.
Right.
Okay. So while these people are no longer saying we need to overthrow society because of capitalism, they are taking a more subtle approach, but they still want to basically overthrow society.
Sure.
That's the fundamental difference between the right and the left. The right looks back into our past and is proud of our past and is supportive of incremental change. But we identify with the past and we like the past.
Yeah.
Whereas the left always say, and I think they're projecting their own internal unhappiness for whatever reason, they want to say that everything that happened in the past was wrong,
yeah,
and that the future will be glorious, and we can have a glorious future by having a lot of state control.
Right, right. So then I guess you make the point in the book, and I just want to get the actual page, is that first chapter of the book is the dominant political party. Now, yes. I guess for my generation, people growing up with me, it's been kind of more split and even from the point at which you could really identify with politics. Mm-hmm. Obviously, you had the long period of Howard, mm-hmm. but then after that, it's kind of been relatively chop and change. Mm-hmm. But that's not always been the case.
No.
So the nation has held 45 federal elections. Labor has won 14. That is a pretty commanding lead on any scoreboard, as you will attest. What do you think is the driving factor? What about it is fundamentally appealing? The Liberal Party is fundamentally appealing to Australians, because that's several generations which have grown up.
Yes. Yeah, no, the Liberal Party has dominated Australian political history, but it's important to note for the viewers that when we talk about the Liberal Party, most people think we're talking about an organisation that started in 1944. Well, that is not true. What Robert Menzies did in 1944 was he rebadged the old party, which was called the United Australia Party. And there's been a consistent organisation since about 1909, when the Progressive Party and the Free Trade Party, who had been at each other's throats, but both were opposed to socialism, and therefore the Labor Party, merged. It's been the same old party ever since. So I think what happens is you only need to live through one or two Labor governments, and they, with only two exceptions, they've always been chaotic. So when people, often young people will get tricked by the rhetoric of the left, which sounds like that they're about more human compassion. But then when they actually live through their governments and they see the outcome of their policies, they turn off them. So the only two every Labor government has been chaotic. And we never get taught this in school, but it's true. And the only two exceptions was the Curtin Chifley government in the 1940s, which was a Labor government, which did a good job, I suppose, in helping us win the war. But they were also in terms of they were a unified government, and they were they weren't at each other's throats. Then we also had the Bob Hawke and Paul Keating governments. Now they were at each other's throats for a little while when Keating overthrew Hawke. But the thing is, it was generally regarded to look back as a very successful government because they followed the Liberal Party on economic space.
Yeah, that's my understanding of it. Is even that government there undertook a series of kind of microeconomic reforms, cutting regulation, making it easier for business, which you would call it like a liberal light.
Oh yes,
policy.
Even better. I mean, look, we should be so grateful. What happened is after World War II, it appeared in the democratic world as though socialism was inevitable. And we would have left-wing governments come in and bring in more socialism, and then we'd have a conservative government which wouldn't reverse the socialism. But they wouldn't add to it, but it would just pause it. And then Margaret Thatcher came along in 1979. She said, no, we are going to reverse this creeping socialism because it's making our society unwell. So she's the one that really had the guts to stand up and say, we're going to reverse it. And she did. And a year after she got elected, Ronald Reagan got elected in America with the same agenda. And those two countries, with those two great leaders, when they brought in these reforms, it caused a recession. Because it's like when you're sick, you got to take the medicine. The medicine doesn't taste good, but it's going to make you better in the longer term. So by the time Bob Hawke and Paul Keating got elected in 1983, and they really didn't have much of an agenda when they campaigned, except for Bob's likeable personality, they'd had the luxury of 4 years of seeing Thatcherism work and Reaganism work. So all they did was they ripped up 9 decades of Labor Party policy, which they had, to their credit, they'd always been very honest. You read Gough Whitlam's speeches in the late 60s and 70s. He was saying, vote for me, and I'm going to bring in a democratic socialist platform. Okay, that's what. But then Hawke came along. He said, you know what we're going to do? We're going to copy Margaret Thatcher. We won't say that we're copying Margaret Thatcher, but we're going to copy Margaret Thatcher. Paul Keating, and then one of the persons who deserves a lot of the credit for that is John Howard, as one of the opposition's and a leader at the time and throughout the 80s, but not always. He was saying to the Liberal Party, saying, you know what we have to do? We have to support these reforms through the Senate and not make it controversial. It's going to be bad for us politically, but good for the country. And John Howard deserves a lot of credit for that. So Keating used to be so Thatcherite. When they used to come into the cabinet, the ministers had to explain how they had found ways to cut spending since they last had a cabinet meeting. Now, unlike every other cabinet I know of, the ministers come in and they're begging for more money so they can go and build some vanity projects. So they have their name on it and say, oh, look what I opened. I just spent $4 billion on this. But no, Keating was the opposite. He said, no, we're going to cut spending. So look, it was a very good period of government. But putting Curtin and Chifley and Hawke and Keating aside, every other Labor government was actually just like the Rudd and Gillard government.
Yeah.
Chaotic and bad policies.
So I guess you've seen kind of, besides obviously the Chifley and the Hawke Keating, I guess kind of the two, what should be diametrically kind of opposed positions. One is the expansion of the state and kind of the imposition of state controls upon the individual. And what should be, on the other side, maximum individual liberty, incentivize enterprise, make the individual, let him choose as much as he can as possibly choose within reason, right? And so that's kind of, I guess, what should be on both sides.
Yes.
Why is kind of the move of the Liberal Party in recent years away from what should be on this side, which is maximum individual liberty, towards more state control of free enterprise? Is that a direct symptom of the fact that factional power brokers and not the membership, not the party as a whole, decide who is representing them?
Well, absolutely. So what's happened is there's two types of people who join the Liberal Party and get active in the Liberal Party. There are people who we'll call true believers, people who believe in policies and ideas. And, look, a small group of people are born and, for whatever reason, by about the age of 8 to 9, they're sort of watching the news and they're asking mum and dad, what's going on there? I'm interested in it.
Sure.
And sometimes people can grow up in political families and they're not interested in politics. And sometimes people can grow up in non-political families and they're very interested in it. It's just one of the ways the good Lord made us all, okay? So having a political interest is a good thing. Now, so the people that join the Liberal Party that are the true believers, which is probably 90% of the members, they're not joining the Liberal Party out of personal ambition. They're joining the Liberal Party out of they're ambitious for the country.
Sure.
And they just want to sort of see free enterprise and good values promoted. Now, the other group of people that join the Liberal Party are people who just see it as a way for them to get into a position of, power, I suppose, but it's really more about sort of personal gratification. They get a kick out of it. They get a kick out of the intrigue. They get a kick out of walking around Parliament House. They don't really believe in anything. And so these people, they then go and call themselves liberal moderates. Now, all that means is they're saying, oh, well, I'm a liberal, but I only moderately believe in it. Now, they like to be able to say that because then they're never asked what they feel strongly about, because they say, well, I'm actually just a moderate. I don't really believe in anything that strongly. They position themselves neatly, if that's the consensus policy position in the Liberal Party, and that's the consensus policy position in the press gallery, the Liberal moderates position themselves neatly in the middle. So they can say, well, we're a Liberal. But then they digest enough media just so they can have a few talking points about how to sound like a Liberal, but also to not upset the press gallery. That's what the Liberal moderate is. They really, look, they don't write books, they don't write opinion pieces, they've really got nothing much to say. So it's unfair to call them left-wing Liberals and us and Conservatives right-wing Liberals, because really they don't believe in anything.
Sure.
That's the key thing.
Right. So I guess if we know that the membership base broadly identifies with kind of values of individual liberty,
Yes.
Then on the basis where we have a plebiscite or a far more democratic process for pre-selection, you won't even end up with a bunch of guys who identify as moderates. That's the idea. We will end up with a high percentage of true liberals.
Well, you will. But look, what will happen is when we have a Democratic Party structure, in a seat like Wentworth, I expect and I hope that we would have someone who was a genuine, let's call it small L liberal, but someone who really believes in those principles. Okay, so this is an area which is affluent, but it's fairly centrist on a lot
like
of...
socially progressive almost.
Yeah, so there'll be a higher number of people in this area who vote Liberal but want Australia to become a republic.
Right.
Or vote Liberal and believe in global warming. Or they might have been very outspoken in favour of same-sex marriage debate. Okay, so it's fine, and it'll only be good for the party if we have a Liberal in Wentworth who is more progressive on those social issues. Okay,
sure.
But we're not seeing that at the moment. We're just seeing, the party dominated by people who just they really run it like a mafia. They want it. It's a business for them.
Sure. So it's not so much that there's kind of this idealistic person we want to come through in every seat. It's more kind of the idea that people should have a range of options and should be able to choose for themselves who they wish to represent them.
Well, look, no system's perfect, but democracy's proven itself to be pretty good.
Sure.
And there's no better alternative. So if we bring in this structure, are we going to occasionally have dud candidates? Yes, but we'll have less dud candidates than we're having now.
Sure. And I guess this one of the themes that kind of runs through your book a little bit, I would say, a fair amount, is the wisdom of the crowd.
Yes.
So the idea that a group of people with varied experiences across a range of different aspects in life and business and whatever, when kind of making a decision collectively, even though they pursue the decision in terms of their own thoughts and whatnot, but when you kind of average it all out, a group of people will be far better at deciding something than a single person or a very small kind of cabal almost of people.
Well, yes, it's the wisdom of the crowd is something that goes back to Aristotle. Pretty smart guy, and that was his observation. He says, the larger the group of people with input into a decision, the more likely it's actually going to be the correct decision. And so, he says, so you can have a small group of specialists in a field. Okay, now sometimes they will sort of know too much, and they won't have a common sense instinct. But if we have a large group of people making a decision, then they very often get it right.
And I guess you could almost look, I guess the election of Donald Trump would be a classic example of that, where a whole bunch of media elites, the top brass of the Democratic Party, but even across all the news networks, so all these people who are paid to be political correspondents, experts in the field, we look at our own ABC. You couldn't find a person who said Donald Trump was even a chance, let alone who was actually going to win. Do you think that what kind of happens is there becomes sort of an echo chamber in which kind of the popular opinion gets bounced across to the point at which it becomes unchallengeable, whilst they are actually separated totally from kind of what the average punter wants?
Well, look, I think what was in the lead up to the Trump election in 2016 is I think that the left-wing elite was so horrified by him winning that they had the view that the more you tell people that he's going to win, and they thought that people could be intimidated into voting for Trump. They were saying, you're a racist, you're a sexist if you vote for Trump. They say that about pretty much every Republican, but they said it more about Trump than usual. Now, the the very interesting thing about the Trump election is that the Americans have a pretty neat rule. There's really only been one exception for more than a century, and that is that a political party gets the White House for at least 2 terms. They don't have 1 term. The only exception was Jimmy Carter, who defeated a Republican in 1976, and then only 4 years later was defeated by a Republican. But every other time, Obama got 2 terms. George W. Bush got 2 terms. Bill Clinton got 2 terms. Reagan and Bush, well, they actually had 3. Kennedy and Johnson had 2 terms. Eisenhower had 2 terms. So and it's actually the same in other English-speaking countries. So in Australia, at a federal level, there's only been one. The last time we had a one-term government was 1931. So everybody else gets 2 terms. Julia Gillard had lots of difficulties. She got 2 terms. Malcolm Turnbull got re-elected. Gough Whitlam got 2 terms. So, and it's almost the same in England. So the point is that people, I think that the quieter middle Australians out there and middle Americans, they think, let's give them another go. Unless they're really catastrophically bad,
Sure.
like Jimmy Carter was. And so, with that in mind, I think the biggest overlooked factor in the Trump election was that the Democrats had their 2 terms.
Sure.
Yeah, and that's standard operating procedure.
Yeah. Now, I want to go to Trump a little bit later. I just want to that was just kind of the wisdom of the crowds,
okay.
I guess.
Yes.
But what I would want is, I guess, what comes across in the book is kind of, you have not only like this is a common sense, logical progression, like it kind of needs to happen, but it also seems like there's kind of an emotional imperative. You're emotionally invested in it. I guess maybe you identify with the values that traditionally come from the Liberal Party so strongly that you feel like it's not just like a logical progression, but almost like an ethical, moral obligation to push through. Do you feel like that's the case?
Well, look, I have this vision in my mind about how great the Liberal Party could truly be. And I think it can be immensely better than it is. And I think we've got all the ingredients. The conservative movement in Australia is actually very strong. We've got terrific journalists on radio, print, TV. World class. We've got terrific think tanks. We've Centre for Independent Studies, the Menzies Research Institute, the IPA, and we've got millions of people out there who identify with the conservative movement. Now, the one missing piece of the jigsaw is the Liberal Party's structure, and so this is why I'm thinking the most important reform that this country needs right now is political reform. Now, once we have political reform, we can then return to a more pro-free enterprise agenda.
Sure. Okay. That makes sense. What would, if you were kind of, we often see, we kind of throughout the West, for whatever reason, there is a kind of pull, like a gravitational pull of young people towards the left, and not just the left, the hard left, towards socialism. And not only that, for a lot of young people, I guess, it almost seems unfathomable, like the idea that you could be like a traditional conservative. What would be your pitch to kind of the younger generation? I mean, there's reports, I've heard reports that the youngest generation coming through now is the most conservative since World War II.
All right.
I've heard that. I don't know how factual it is. It's been passed around. But what would your pitch be to someone my age, or just a little bit older, or just a little bit younger, to be a conservative?
Okay, well, the first thing to bear in mind is that it's a worldwide historical phenomenon that young people vote for the left. Now, what happens as they get older and they live more life and they meet good people in life, they meet bad people in life, they have a few ups and downs. By the time they get over 50, they're staunchly voting Liberal. Now, the most left-wing youth generation since World War II was the 1960s. Now, the left might seem like they're a bit out of control right now, and they are pretty out of control, but like they're not letting off bombs. And this is what was happening in the 1960s. Radical Marxist students were blowing up police stations.
Sure.
And there was lots of violence. And so things are pretty bad right now, but we need to keep it in perspective. the left can get a lot further out of control than after they have, and in the 1920s, the communists were out of control in the United States as well. So it seems to happen about once every 50 years. They they have this sort of...
Have a bit of a meltdown.
They have a bit of a meltdown, that's right. So, but what I would say to young people is this, in terms of, you asked me for the pitch.
Sure.
Okay, so young people, let's say you're 18 and you're voting for the first time. Okay, now it was only 10 years ago, which is just yesterday, you were 8. You were a little child who knew nothing. And now when they get to 18, young people do have faster brains. They can learn things quicker.
Yeah.
Okay. But they obviously lack life experience and therefore wisdom. And so they've got these faster brains than older people. And they become very sure of their own opinions. But in fact, they should be much more humble and say, I'm just starting out in life. I've got lots to learn. So another thing that the left will do is they can come up with these very flowery sounding words, like about how we're going to save the environment and we're going to help poor people and we're going to help refugees. And young people who've got good hearts hear this and I think, well, of course I believe that. I want to do that. I want to do that. And they get tricked to support left-wing ideas because of these soothing words. Mm-hmm. But once people get older, they can see through these charlatans and they can say, okay, well, look, I know your rhetoric might sound nice, but in fact, if we follow through on your policies, there's actually going to be more human suffering.
Do you think as well, it's kind of, there is the inherent friction between individual responsibility and kind of the collective, it's not your fault, it's everyone else's fault, society's unfair. And that the friction between these two ideas, which is kind of the fundamental basis of the right and the left. Yes. The left is that kind of we can separate people into groups and whoever's on the top must necessarily be the oppressor and whoever's on the bottom must by necessity be the oppressed. Yep. That's a much easier thing for young people to swallow if they feel like they've had a tough run, is the idea that there's someone up above in the ether, in the the stratosphere, who's working hard against them, rather than kind of the opposite position, which is, I guess, quite daunting and almost frightening for some people, where you say, look, stuff happens, but you're ultimately responsible for your own outcome. Do you think, number one, the idea of individual responsibility is kind of lost on young people, particularly these days, or has this always been the case? And do you think this is amplified by, I guess, higher education and kind of the way that education is structured?
It does disturb me. I remember growing up reading nursery, like little kids' stories, and a lot of those stories were about self-reliance and hard work, and you're going to have a few knocks in life, but get yourself back up. And I've got a couple of young children now, and I read these stories. It seems to that message does seem to be absent from a lot of these current stories. Which now this is coming from the long march through the institutions, where the former Marxists and the people they who want to overthrow society, they're now doing it in slow motion, but they're still doing it, and they want us to all feel like we're dependent. Well, the truth is, the only societies that ever work is when there is robust free market capitalism. It's the only thing that's ever worked. The more capitalism a country has had, the more wealth its people have had. And the more socialism people have had, the more misery that they've had. It's as simple as that.
It almost seems remarkable. Like, I remember listening to Friedrich Hayek, who's he kind of gave this little spiel on why particularly intellectuals drift towards socialism. And it's something that Thomas Sowell as well has kind of echoed, is the idea that these intellectuals, they produce ideas, right? They don't have to buy and sell these ideas. They don't have to pitch it so much. If a builder builds a bridge and the bridge falls down, he pays the consequences. But if an academic makes an outlandish remark about the detriments of capitalism, there's nothing kind of stopping him. There's no it's kind of all out there in the ether. It doesn't really have any tangible. You can't hold on to it. You can't say that's declining value, whatever. Where have the Conservatives in universities gone? Where are they? Or even education in general. Like, you go through high school and you look at the curriculum and you say, well, this is... Anyone can see that it's moved towards the left. Now, I'm not here to say whether that's good or bad or whatever, but it's happening.
Look, it could be, I was interested in your comment earlier where you heard that this could be the most conservative youth generation since World War II. I'm quite open to that because young kids, by the time they first leave school, they do want to rebel against what they've been taught,
Sure.
and they've largely been taught by their teachers. Now, they all know that they've been taught left-wing crap a lot of the time, and so what they are doing is maybe they are rebelling against it. I mean, I understand that high school kids these days learn a hell of a lot about Aboriginal history. Well, I'm pretty interested in Aboriginal prehistory as well, but I mean, I would have thought that kids at high school would have been better equipped for life if they sort of knew what happened with World War II or the Cold War, these big things, or even, the English Civil Wars, or the Romans, or the Greeks. These are all monumental things. And I remember at school we used to get taught about Captain Cook and all the explorers to Australia, and the kids don't get taught that anymore. But it could be the left could be setting themselves up for a big problem here because maybe the kids will rebel against all this nonsense.
I feel like that's what happens. I feel like there is kind of this natural push and pull, kind of I guess the youthful resistance almost. People feel like, particularly young people feel like they want to push back against kind of the strictures of the society, against their elders, and that's kind of a natural thing. And when kind of the older generation, it doesn't have to be older and older, but it could just be the one above, like for instance this generation pushing against millennials or whatever. You often see, like I've noticed, for instance, that the funniest comedians, in my opinion, estimation are the ones who are making fun of political correctness at the moment. You see, like on the internet, the funniest memes and stuff like that are the ones making fun of the people who, pretend that there's like 58 genders, stuff like that. Because what happens is when there's this echo chamber of like people know that's crazy, but you can't say that. You can't say it's crazy. That it gets more and more crazy as it goes off, and the kids go, well, I can see that that's ridiculous. The idea that there are 58 genders. So then, like the funny thing is when the kids push back against it, point out how ridiculous it is. My brother's going to be 18. He's totally amongst and sees that all the time. Like younger kids pushing back against this kind of ridiculous fringes. It's promising, but I guess it is kind of natural as well.
Well, it's going to be interesting to see where all this identity politics does end up. It could just peter out. I mean, the left do, about once every 10 years, they get themselves all tied up in knots over a certain issue, and then they move on to another one. And whatever issue they have in mind at the time, it's always like the most apocalyptic, of apocalyptic importance.
Yeah.
Okay, so 10 years ago it was all global warming.
Sure.
And then 10 years prior to that, it was all about, in this country, all about saying sorry to Aborigines. It's just what the left, that's all that was in their brain. And then it was global warming. And now it's identity politics. And, they go through these fads.
Do you think that's kind of a symptom of I've heard as well that with the left, they tend to eat themselves on the fringes, because when you separate everyone into oppressed versus oppressor, everyone by nature is full of 100 different identifying characteristics, right? So people of different races and different genders, when you try and fit them into into the hierarchy, there's going to be some kind of overlap where one ends up being on the bottom of one but on the top of the other, right? So then you have what happens is on the fringes when you're kind of trying to split people up as they do into group A, B and C. There's people with kind of a mixing of characteristics amongst the three groups. So when they try and confront each other and say, well, I'm out of all of us, I'm the most oppressed, then someone says, well, you can't be more oppressed than I am because I've got these. I fit into this box. And so it kind of eats itself more than it actually kind of fizzles out. Like, for instance, you see among the people who say that there are more than two genders, and then you have kind of the hardcore feminists. The hardcore feminists are saying, well, you can't be a woman. You can't just pick and choose you're a woman. I'm a woman. I'm oppressed. You can't choose to kind of identify with what my life experience is. And so you have kind of that friction between, you don't just get to choose, because, you know, if I wanted to, I wouldn't want to identify as a woman, because then I wouldn't have all this discrimination against me, whatever. But maybe it kind of eats itself as well.
Well, it does eat itself. It reminds me of the French Revolution, which is a very long and complex story. Okay, I recently sat through a podcast on it. Now there's a hell of a lot of detail on that revolution, but for the purpose of this conversation, the interesting thing was, it's exactly what you say, they eat themselves. Okay, so there would be one group would get behind, would get political power, and they'd have to go and wipe out, the people who previously had the power, and then it would just keep, there'd always be another group who's now become the evil one and who now need to be oppressed. And so the guy that cut off the most amount of people's heads was Robespierre. Well, he ended up getting his own head cut off. Okay, so this is what the lefties will do, because you're right. I mean, if you're going to segment people, then there's going to be conflict. Well, the better way of looking at it is just treat everybody like an awesome individual. Just and just be great and have a sense of gratitude that you're actually alive, because it's better than you're either alive or you're dead. And there should always be, when you've got life, say, well, I'm pretty happy about this situation. And I think that's at the heart of what's in a conservative's soul. Sure. I think the lefties, so often, I'm not talking about young lefties, but people who are still left-wing by the age of 40 or 50, they are so often miserable people. Now, there, of course, there's exceptions, but I think that they're projecting their own unhappiness onto the rest of the world, and they see the world through this misery prism. And they want others to see the world through the misery prism as well. Sure,
I think if you listen to some psychologists, and even kind of neuroscientists, what they say is that there is actually a release of adrenaline and serotonin and all those feel-good chemicals when you reach a goal, right? So when you kind of say the individual is responsible for his own success or failures or whatever, when an individual, if the person believes that I'm an individual rather than part of the collective and I'm responsible for my own outcomes, potentially it could be that by the individual who reaches his own goals, he's constantly striving to be better, number one, but also to be happier, number two. And not only that, if you take the opposite, which is the idea that I can't be responsible for anything, I'm kind of necessarily oppressed or whatever, there is no goal setting, because it's kind of this nihilistic fatalism which overcomes these people, which says, well, it doesn't matter what I do, I'm oppressed anyway. I can't ever achieve anything. I can't move forward. I mean, that must necessarily be like the most miserable, awful state of affairs that you could imagine, which is exactly kind of the strictures that define the far left.
And it's also unnatural, this impulse. Sure. Because we're all the product of 4 billion years of reproduction. And, all of our ancestors have survived. And so, we've got the survival instinct in us. And so when they do want us to feel like we are incapable of achieving, it's naturally bringing about misery, because it's not what the human spirit is.
Sure. But I guess as well, that's why you take the idea that people are supposed to be competing against one another as well. There is kind of this natural human, particularly male instinct, to compete against other males, to assert dominance, to show strength. And there is some kind of sense of self-fulfillment and gratitude when you win a competition, of course. Like, it's difficult to replicate when you beat your peers at something. And that is a natural thing. But when you say there is no hierarchy, there is only two oppressor and oppressed. There is no first, second, third, fourth. There is only a mixture of power and the people who have not. Then you're also taking that away. The idea that blokes particularly like to compete against each other. And so, for instance, now you have all these guys who are sitting around, they're depressed or unhappy, but also, I guess competition is one of the ways in which you can express controlled aggression. But when you take that away from guys, they end up being bitter, unhappy, but also can express extreme violence as well.
Right, well, that doesn't sound good at all.
No, it sounds like an awful state of affairs.
Yes.
I know you're a massive fan of US politics. I've only just started recently, I guess for about the past kind of 2 or 3 years, really started taking an interest.
Okay.
I find it fascinating, particularly kind of the theatre of it. There is kind of an aspect of the drama and the tension, which is not, I wouldn't say, unique to the US, but it is, I would say, most manifest in US politics.
Well, it's the biggest stage.
It's the biggest.
Because it's the biggest political stage. That's why there's so much drama on it.
So the past week has been a big week in US politics. We've had the hearing of Judge Kavanaugh, who was the nominee for the Supreme Court. Then we had, in the same week that he was supposed to be confirmed, I believe, we've had 3 or 4 separate accusations of sexual misconduct, all dating back further than 30 years, I believe.
Yes.
All within the same week.
Yes.
The week in which he's supposed to be confirmed.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
Now, there are some familiar characters playing a role. Michael Avenatti, the lawyer for Stormy Daniels. He's there. He's representing Swetnick.
Okay, yes.
I think so. But for whatever reason, Judge Kavanaugh, who has lots of experience as a judge, has found himself at the centre of a number of allegations which may potentially derail his nomination. Now, what was your headline reaction at the first allegation of sexual misconduct more than 35 years ago?
So it's important to put this process, because it is a dramatic moment in American politics, and it's legal history as well. In the last roughly 3 decades, the 9 justices on the High Court have been fairly reliably split in this matter. There's been 4 right-wingers, there's been 4 left-wingers, and there's been Justice Anthony Kennedy in the middle, who was the swing vote. And Justice Anthony Kennedy would usually vote with the right on economic issues and gun issues, and usually vote with the left on social issues, same-sex marriage, abortion, things like that.
And this is the Supreme Court.
This is the Supreme Court.
And what's the purpose? What's the purpose of the Supreme Court?
Well, it's the highest court in the land, and really in the whole world. And when they have a contentious law or a contentious legal case, when the Supreme Court gives a ruling, it's final. It's final because it's final. There's no further appeal after the Supreme Court has spoken. So the Supreme Court has always been political since George Washington, but it's very political now. But the key thing is Justice Kennedy has been the swing vote. Justice Kennedy has resigned, and that's why they need to find a replacement. So the Constitution says that the President appoints someone to the Supreme Court, but a majority of the Senate has to approve them or ratify them. So this person, Brett Kavanaugh, that they've put up, he will make the Supreme Court not 4 versus 4 with one swing in the middle. It'll make it pretty solid right.
5-4.
Pretty solid 5-4. Okay. Now, then the other thing is that there's a very old Justice, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who's on the Supreme Court, who's one of the most reliable left-wing votes. Well, she's very, very old and frail, and the left is furious at her for not retiring under Obama, because then Obama could have appointed her replacement.
Sure.
She is... It's hard
because it is a lifetime appointment, is it not?
It is, unlike our Australian Constitution, which I think our actual Constitution says you have to retire as the High Court Justice. I think it's 70 or 75. But the United States, yes.
You get to go till you cark it or you resign.
That is correct. That's
okay.
Right. So they normally try to resign when you've got a favourable president, so your replacement. So when President Obama had 2 Supreme Court nominees to make, and they got through without any difficulty, okay, because they were replacing a lefty with a lefty.
Yeah.
Okay, but also the right wing, the Conservatives don't go as crazy as the left does. But the reason why Justice Kavanaugh has been having, Molotov cocktails thrown at him every 15 minutes here is because the left is just fanatically determined to do everything they can to stop the court going 5-4.
Sure.
That's the background. So this Brett Kavanaugh has stepped into the firing line, and this is just the beginning. They will come up with anything until they break this guy. And what they're hoping is that the Supreme Court won't make its decision before the midterm elections. And then they're hoping that the Democrats get control of the Senate, which they may well do. Feels as though the Republicans will still retain a majority, but it's very much in the balance. So then they're hoping, okay, this new justice is going to have to be approved by a Democrat Senate. That's what they're hoping for.
Yeah. And they'll probably kibosh that.
Oh, what? Sorry.
They'll kibosh it and get rid of it. Like, will they make sure that he's not going to be...
Oh, well, yeah, they would say there's no way on earth that you're going to get through Brett Kavanaugh. So then they would say to President Trump, okay, you recommended this guy, Kavanaugh. We've said get lost. So send us someone else. Now, then Trump would then be forced to send somebody to them who is acceptable to him, but also acceptable to the Democrats. So look, I love the Republican Party in the United States, okay, but no party is perfect. Now they, I believe, they helped lay they helped sort of sow the seeds of bad blood here. Because what happened in the last year of Obama's term, with about 8 months to go, a right-wing judge, Justice Antonin Scalia, suddenly died. And Obama was the president. But the Republicans had control of the Senate. So Obama put up this guy who was pretty favourable to the Republicans. He was a Democrat, but he was not a hardcore partisan Democrat. And the Republicans said, we're not going to vote on it. We're going to wait till after the presidential election. Now, that was like straining the fabric of the Constitution. I would like it to get back to the situation with the Supreme Court, which is what it was up until quite recently. Whereas to get approved by the Senate, you need 60% support. So that means you can't put up someone who is like really fiercely conservative or really fiercely left-wing because they've got to get bipartisan support. So that would be a better system than what's happening now is. And it's...
Do you think in the long term it's healthier for the United States and I guess everyone else who's dependent on it? This is kind of what happens now is a more short-term gain for longer-term.
Well, look, when you stretch the Constitution for political gain, what it does is it fuels the internal divisions in the country, which is not good. So I believe America is a similar situation to where the Roman Republic was from after by about, say, 140 BC, the Romans had taken full control, not just of the Italian peninsula, but pretty much the whole Mediterranean. And they were like all supreme. And it was an extraordinary accomplishment. I mean, it took them about 3 centuries just to take over the Roman peninsula. And then they took over North Africa and Spain and Greece and Asia Minor and pretty much Egypt as well. Not officially, but anyway, my point is, once they had supreme political, military power and economic power and political power, they then turned on themselves, the Romans. And that was really what brought the Republic down. And they had massive internal divisions. And it resulted in like a hell of a lot of blood being shed on the streets of Rome with these big purges, and it went on for a good century, until the Republic was no more and it became under the Emperor. So people sometimes say, it's a very silly thing to say, that America is like Rome and Rome fell and America is on the verge of falling. Well, that's complete crap. Rome was around for well over 1,000 years. And if America, you're going to compare America to Rome, and there are a lot of parallels. America is still in its infancy. It's really what it was like at about 148 BC, where they've got all supremacy, but now they are turning in on themselves. But what the Romans did, the ones that helped sort of shred the old republic, is that they kept pushing the rules that had been around for centuries, these gentlemanly agreements about how to keep the internal peace, and people started violating that. And it's no one's getting killed in America over political conflict, but I think there are some parallels there.
It is obviously you have a Republican base which would obviously prefer someone who is more favourable to their cause, someone who's socially conservative. But from what you're saying, it seems like the middle ground may be the one that prevents further carnage and damage in the longer term. But would you rely on the Democrats? So would you have to amend the Constitution to make it 60% requirement in the Senate?
Look, I don't know the exact details, but I feel like it just happened in the last 10 years. And I think both the Democrats and Republicans have been playing around with the rules for partisan gain. I don't think it's a constitutional requirement. I think the Senate itself could vote for it.
Okay. Do you believe he'll be confirmed, Kavanaugh?
I saw a poll on the way over, fairly reliable sounding poll. It said 40% of Americans believe Kavanaugh is guilty of what he's accused of. 30% think he's innocent, and 30% are undecided.
Okay.
Look, and when I last saw a betting market, that said it's more likely he will be confirmed than not confirmed. There's 3 Republicans who may not vote for him. They'll be under enormous pressure. Look, we're not. Well, they've now got an FBI investigation, and that's going to take a week. So we'll see what happens there.
Sure.
That investigation could easily come back and saying, look, there's no ground for criminal charges here. We don't have any evidence.
What is the FBI? Because I understand it's not a federal crime. Okay, the FBI normally doesn't have jurisdiction over what would be a state crime, essentially, governed by state rules. I mean, it felt like the request by Ford for an FBI investigation was a deliberate delaying tactic, considering the fact that it's outside the FBI's jurisdiction. That would be like me asking the AFP to investigate someone who'd scratched my car or something like that. Now, it also smacks a little bit of the Anita Hill, Clarence Thomas nomination. why? Well, let's just say that in the next week the FBI comes up with nothing.
Mm-hmm.
Right, which I think could be...
Seems quite likely. Because, likely. Look, she's a very credible witness, but, I mean, there is no legal... She's got no corroborating evidence.
No.
So, the people that she said were at the party, all of them have said that they weren't at the party.
Sure.
And, look, Justice Kavanaugh, he's kept a very accurate daily diary for his whole life, including this period.
Yeah.
And I don't think he was even in the town he was accused of where this occurred. But, look, it is a bit mysterious because I watched her testimony live the other night and I thought to myself, you know what, she doesn't look like she's lying to me.
That's what Trump said. Yeah. Trump said it was compelling.
Yeah. Well, but still, I mean, look, compelling is still not evidence.
Well, yeah. So, that's the burden of proof is not to be shown to be compelling.
Yeah.
It's beyond reasonable doubt. And with no corroborating evidence, it's difficult to... Does he set a dangerous precedent, though? A character assassination of this magnitude, on this scale, for a Supreme Court nominee. Now, regardless of whether you think he shouldn't kind of be as conservative or as progressive, does this not set a dangerous precedent that if the Republicans roll over on this and they say, all right, fair enough, okay, that it's a forfeit in terms of ideals and virtues almost.
Well, in my lifetime, there's been 3 really intense Supreme Court nomination hearings. There was a guy called Robert Bork in the late 1980s who was a complete legal genius, and they just destroyed him in these Senate confirmation hearings, and he didn't get supported by the Senate in the end. They were criticising him for being, I don't think it was personal misbehaviour, they were just saying he was illegal. I think they were saying he was like extreme right or something. But anyway, the term balked, because his name was Robert Bork, to be balked means, it's not a term we use in Australia, but in America it means sort of, just non-stop harassment and intimidation until they get out. Then there was, Clarence Thomas and Anita Hill. Well, he did get confirmed, but that was still very bitter. And now we've got this one. Now, the thing that all those 3 nominations have got in common is that they were all appointed by a Republican president, and it was the left that went completely hysterical. And it's happening again now. I can't think of a time when President Obama put up his 2 nominees for the Supreme Court, lots of Republicans voted for them. Okay, so it's the left are the ones that go the most hysterical, who won't accept the outcome.
Sure.
And want to bring in personal attacks. This reflects their nature about if they can't have power fairly, they'll just sort of try and take it over.
Well, I guess they wish to just overthrow the whole thing. They'd rather turn the whole table over than try and negotiate a better outcome.
Yes.
They want to see the thing burn. Almost like the Joker in Batman, Heath Ledger.
Okay.
All time. Now, I wanted to ask you, coming back to your book a little bit, we've had ScoMo elevated to the highest position in the land. We've had Frydenberg as his deputy, not who I would have picked, but as if you listen to the second podcast, not who I would have picked, but that's you just got to roll with the punches, I guess, in this state of affairs. Not many people back the Libs as almost having any chance at the next election. Now, you follow it closer than most. You've written the guide to how to get back to the promised land. First question, of all the possible candidates who were in the party room at the time, so of all the available MPs, who had the best chance of winning the election?
Well, look, I believe that under all the circumstances, I believe that was clearly Malcolm Turnbull. Now, most Conservatives in the party
Really?
Yeah, well, I believe Malcolm Turnbull was going to quite easily win the next election. I mean, the polls had... a year ago, the polls were typically 54 Labor, 46 Liberal.
Sure.
Now, up until the time they deposed him, it just kept getting narrower and narrower. So they were consistently 51-49.
Yeah.
Now, that is a government. If the incumbent is 49, 6 to 9 months out from an election, that incumbent is going to win the election. Okay. When a government is on track to lose, like Julia Gillard was, and John Howard was in 2007, the polls 6 to 9 months out are like 60% for the opposition to 40.
Right.
Okay, massive. Now, even then, it still narrows on election day.
Yeah.
But it's massive disconnect. Malcolm Turnbull, who I'm very disappointed with his policy direction. Okay.
Sure.
And a big part of me was happy to see him go. Okay, but look, just like Tony Abbott was on track to win in 2016 before he got deposed. Because, like we were saying before, incumbent governments tend to get re-elected. Sure. Particularly first-term ones. I believe Malcolm Turnbull was on track to win the election. Now, but with Malcolm out of the race, look, Tony Abbott's only ever had 2 opportunities to contest a federal election, and on both occasions he has overperformed. So I know that he often doesn't go that good in polling, but in the actual poll that really counts, like called a federal election, Tony does well. In 2010, he almost knocked off a first-term government. First time it would have happened since 1931.
Yeah.
In fact, he really did win that election because we had Oakeshott and Windsor representing 2 formerly National Party heartland seats, and their voters understandably assumed that yes, they'll vote for an independent, but because both of these guys had been National Party members,
that they would
in a hung parliament they would vote with the coalition.
Sure.
So really, Tony Abbott did win in 2010, and he had a big thumping win in 2013 against Kevin Rudd. So, but look, in terms of the next election, the betting markets say there's about an 80% chance Labor will win. I'm starting to think that Morrison is going to win the election. And that's because, look, he comes across as competent. He ain't no Margaret Thatcher, where he's driving a principled conservative agenda, because I don't think he really believes in it. I don't think Scott Morrison has ever written an opinion piece for any media outlet. He's not a deep thinker, but he's a very political person, and I think that he comes across as reasonably likable, pretty sort of like a centrist type of a person, and he comes across as reasonably competent. Now, when you contrast that with Bill Shorten, who I don't think does come across as that likeable.
Well, you could see that in I guess, the difference between the preferred Prime Minister polling and the two-party preferred.
Yes.
That gap is quite substantial, and has been since he's been leader of the opposition.
That's right.
Obviously, something is not resonating with the average Australian about Bill Shorten.
Well, he keeps campaigning from the hard left. I mean, the Labor Party this weekend, or sometime soon, is debating whether to have micro quotas for Aboriginal people and gay people. Okay, well, I don't think that's going to get through the Labor Party conference, but even the fact that they're debating that is turning off voters in Middle Australia. And I think Shorten, when he first came into Parliament, all the buzz about him was that he was going to be just like Bob Hawke. He was a union leader who's mates with big business. And he's a big right-wing Labor guy. And that was all the buzz around Shorten when he first came along, burst onto the scene. But since Jeremy Corbyn's surprisingly strong result in the 2016 British general election, when Corbyn was given no hope but actually performed very well in terms of the amount of seats he won, I think Shorten just seems to have said, let's be like Jeremy Corbyn. Let's be really left-wing on everything. And I'm thinking, mate, you got to try and win a federal election here. Shouldn't you be trying to govern from the centre? Yeah. I don't understand what his tactics are, because I don't believe he's sincere about it, because he's always been right-wing Labor, and now he's pretending like he's left-wing Labor. And Anthony Albanese has always been left-wing Labor, and he recently got in trouble for giving a speech recently that was too pro-business. Okay, so it's all a bit scrambled at the moment.
Is this kind of, so we've got a couple of situations there. You've just named them, where you've got guys who it appears are campaigning for positions in which they don't actually believe, right? Mm-hmm. Is this, and even I've seen it, you can see it on the right as well. You saw with Malcolm Turnbull, who was a member, I believe, of the Communist Party or something like that, wasn't he? When he was the early 70s, wasn't it? Or
no, I think someone in his family may have. I don't think that was Malcolm.
You don't think that was Malcolm?
Not a member of the Communist Party.
Okay,
no.
Well, I remember. I don't know where I heard it, but I remember hearing something about him being aligned with the communists. Anyway,
well, if you go to, there's a website, stopturnbull.com. Okay, and that is, I don't know who put that together, but someone has done an enormous amount of research on Malcolm Turnbull. So if there's any evidence, it will be in that website.
Okay. Well, that could have been fake news from my part, very easily. But I'm glad we got the fact checker here. But to the larger point, you saw Malcolm Turnbull govern almost from the centre, closer to the left. If anything, is this again just the standard? What happens when people are pre-selected not on what's appealing to the mass membership, but to what's kind of cool and hip and trendy in the seat of Wentworth?
Well, look, I think Malcolm had the potential to be a great Prime Minister of the left in this country. He should have joined the Labor Party. Yeah. He wanted to join the Labor Party, and he went to their top people, Bob Hawke, Graham Richardson, Stephen Leasley, all these people who say exactly the same thing, that on multiple occasions he tried to join the Labor Party. And I believe they are 100% telling the truth. And Malcolm should have had the guts when these party grandees told him, no, you shouldn't join the Labor Party. He should have said, well, get stuffed.
I'm going to do it anyway.
I'm going to bulldoze through here because I am a man of the left, which he clearly is. Now, he then thought, okay, well, if Labor won't let me in, I'll just bulldoze my way through this Liberal Party, which has much weaker internal structures, and I'll be able to get away with what I want there.
Yeah.
He should have persisted with the left. He should have persisted with the Labor Party. He could have been Prime Minister for 10 years as a pro-business Labor man. It could have been a good combination, particularly for him.
Yeah, I can see that. That's what it felt like. That's what it felt like. There was never a point when I was watching it anyway where he got up and I was like, that is the man who I can see is an actual representative of the party in which I would vote for. Yes. Right? There seemed to be that kind of natural disconnect. Anyways, on this show, we often like to Dukes and I gave each other an opportunity to rant about whatever topic, 60 seconds or whatever it is. Is there anything you've seen, you want to let off your chest, you feel like needs to be heard? It doesn't even have to be related to this. This could be the furthest thing. You could be ripping on the publisher. We don't really care. It could be anything. Is there anything in which, could be the NRL Grand Final, could be the AFL. Is there anything in which you thought that's ridiculous? God, I wish I had a platform to have a rant about this.
Well, I would just really like to rant about the little book, Make the Liberal Party Great Again. I'm hoping the viewers can go to the website, maketheliberalpartygreatagain.com.au. There's an about page there which spells out how it's about, and there's an opportunity there to order a copy of the book, which I hope you do, and I hope you read it. And we're hoping to have a number of launches across Australia to keep getting the message out there.
A Michelle Obama type tour book launch. Have you read about this? Have you heard about Michelle Obama? It's going to be bigger than Madonna's. She's going to be packing out. She's doing more than 40 totally packed out venues for her new book.
Oh. Coming to Australia?
I don't think so.
Okay.
I don't think so. But yeah, it's going to be a Madonna style tour. That's what I read. Anyway, it's going to be bigger than Ben-Hur.
Okay.
For Michelle Obama. You've given a shout out to Margaret Thatcher, Menzies, and Reagan. We also do a shout out, just a quick shout out. If there's anyone current, past, that you think people need to look up, or has kind of been lost in the books of history.
Okay. Well, I'll tell you who the greatest Prime Minister in Australian history is. And that's, it's probably Menzies, but it's Menzies or Joe Lyons. Joe Lyons won the biggest election victory in Australian history. He got almost 60% of the vote in 1931. He had been the Labor Premier of Tasmania. He then came into the Labor government. Labor got elected in 1929 under James Scullin. And Scullin invited Lyons to be his treasurer. And Labor had been out of power for about 15 years. So no one in this Labor government had served in a cabinet before or been a minister, except for Lyons, because he'd been a Premier of Tasmania. And then poor old James Scullin, who I think was a pretty decent guy, he's got this new government. He's running the great country Australia, and about a week after he gets sworn in, the Wall Street crashes, which triggered the Depression in 1929. And so the Scullin government just had no idea how to run a government, and they had a massive crisis on their hands, economic crisis. And there was, extreme bitterness and division within that Labor government, and Joe Lyons defected to the Conservative side of politics. The Labor treasurer defected and became the leader of the opposition.
Is that the only time that's happened?
No, it happened to the Labor Party in 1916 as well. In fact, the Labor Prime Minister, Billy Hughes, he defected to the Conservatives.
A sitting Prime Minister?
Sitting Prime Minister, yes, that's right, yes. So it's happened twice in the Labor Party. So, Joe Lyons, Australia, when the Great Depression started around the world, Australia was one of the worst Western countries in terms of the effect it was having. And then Joe Lyons came in and won a massive thumping victory. Remember we mentioned before that first-term governments get re-elected, and I said, since 1931. Well, that Labor government of Scullin did not get re-elected. Joe Lyons got about almost 60% of the vote, and then he won another 2 elections pretty comfortably. But when we came out of the Great Depression, Australia was in one of the strongest positions economically of all the other Western countries. So we went into it in a very weak way. We came out of it in a very strong way, and it was because Joe Lyons was anti-socialism and was just into sound fiscal policy. Sounds boring, but that's what really helped lay the foundations for a great Australia today.
Well, there we go. Mr. Lyons. But not someone you would hear about.
You never hear about Joe Lyons. Liberals never talk about him because he ended up having a massive fight with Menzies, and Lyons was in the right.
Right.
And in fact, in the middle, because Menzies wanted to become the Prime Minister, wanted to knock him off through the party room. And then in the middle of that party room war, Joe Lyons has a heart attack and dies. Okay, so Menzies then became Prime Minister because of Joe Lyons' heart attack. But Joe Lyons and Robert Menzies was the one that got Lyons to defect. He was the one that would secretly meeting with him and say, hey, look, you can become the Prime Minister if you defect, and you can save the country as well, which is a pretty good thing to do.
Yeah.
But Liberals forget about Joe Lyons because all of our focus is on Menzies. And anything that happened before, Liberals don't know anything about.
Sure.
Labor ignores Joe Lyons because he's a rat.
Yeah.
A Labor rat. Okay? So the 2 big political movements in this country ignore Joe Lyons.
Yeah.
But the fact is, he's arguably our greatest Prime Minister.
Wow. Well, that is certainly a shout out, and I would hope that people listen to this become more interested, I guess, in the history of the Liberal Party, but I guess the Australian political system in general, particularly since 1901. But more specifically, actually understand, I guess, kind of the importance, because everyone feels the consequences of policies that are misdirected and not aimed at the members, but more for a small cabal of self-interested government, government employees. I guess that's what you call MPs, really. We pay the price, both in terms of bad policy as well as their salary. So if there's any possible way in which we can improve the outcomes for every Australian, then I think that should will definitely be listened to. Absolutely. I think it's absolutely an imperative thing. I have read the book.
Good, thank you.
Super easy read, I would say.
Good.
Really easy read. I read it in about 5 or 6 hours, maybe.
Oh, good.
It's not like dense or wordy or flowery. It's facts and basic common sense, which I think is lacking.
I'm very pleased.
So I will want to thank Johnny Ruddick for coming on the podcast.
Thank you very much for having me.
No worries at all. I don't really have anything to plug besides our sponsor, as always. I would like to give a massive thanks to My Style Suits, started by two boys in Parramatta, aiming to give young people a suit for a fraction of the price they normally pay for rentals. 1 to 2 business days delivery. Unbelievable quality. I can't speak more on the quality. It's unbelievable. You get a wool, 100% wool or the wool polyester blend. 2 weeks rental for $100 or $80 if you get the blend. It's unbelievable. Great service. 1 to 2 business day delivery. Thank you to My Style Suits. And thank you to Johnny Ruddick.
Thank you, Alexander. Thank you.